Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of The Teacher's Point of View. I've got somebody I didn't expect to get onto the podcast. I mean, he's a very busy man and he's been really busy over the last sort of 14 to 16 months, haven't you, Carl? So Carl Ward, everybody, he's the chair of Fed, and they're on a journey at the moment in terms of trying to create a 10-year plan for education, because a lot of people believe that there needs to be a reform. So Carl, just before we go into what Fed are doing, would you mind just introducing yourself and kind of your journey in education, please?
Yeah, nice to be with you, TJ. I know we've had to postpone this a few times, this recording, just because of workload, different things. So my apologies about that, but it's really nice to be with you to talk about the Foundation for Education Development and I suppose, the further development of our education system in England. But I suppose, a bit of my history. To start with, one might say, I think it was the question. So I grew up in a estate in Crewe in Cheshire, and although when most people hear of the word the county Cheshire, they probably think of a stockbroker belt. That's not Crewe. Crewe's quite a disadvantaged community, built on the advancement of the railways many years ago, I suppose one of the things that's interesting is that I'm still the only person in my family that comes from Crewe to have got university. And, we're in 2021. And that's just a reflection from that point of view. And indeed, I went to university later in life. I did what, most other people in Crewe at the time when I left school back in the 1980s. So, yeah, sadly, I am perhaps a little bit older than, well, perhaps it's the other way around. I don't know. But yeah, I did what most people do and then go and get a job. That was interesting for me. I gained an awful lot of experience. I fell into working in ICT, or IT as it was called at the time, in the late sort of 1980s, which I've got to say did help on my career path as I went towards the future. And then when I was in my early 20s, I decided I wanted to be a teacher and went through university to become a teacher. I started off being a teacher in the sort of mid-1990s when IT was just getting into schools. And I remember being an NQT in a secondary school, and the head employed me specifically because I was one of a generation of qualified ICT teachers in schools rather than teachers who've been retrained. And remember, my first sort of couple of weeks, there was a stack of machines in boxes, and the head said to me, "I've just bought a network for the school, Carl. I'd like you to put." So my first 3 or 4 years about being an ICT teacher, one might say, was teaching computing and all that sort of thing, and setting. I was literally the all-rounder in the ICT department as well as a teacher, but they were absolutely great days from that point of view. And then I as one does in education, I moved up to be head of department, head of year. I was also exam secretary for a period of time when I do the exam secretary role, and it wasn't an admin role. And then you move into senior leadership over a period of time. I often quit to my senior team here in the day job, which is now chief executive of the Academy Trust, that I've probably done every job in the trust. And there are probably very few people days that can say that because of the changing way that education's moved over the last few years. So I was one of probably the first chief executives of Multi-Academy Trust. I've been doing this for about 8 years now, when trusts first came in. But I was very fortunate before that, when Multi-Academy Trust exist, to work under Gordon Brown when he was Prime Minister, in something called his Talent and Enterprise Taskforce. And I was somebody who worked in that time, as well as being a deputy head in a school at the time, to look at the way outward-facing schools would operate in communities. So the forerunners of maths in many ways, how schools could join together to collaborate. And I'm a passionate believer that collaboration and schools coming together to solve problems is absolutely the thing that best serves children in our communities. That's why I'm a first math leaders in the country. It's why I'm still doing that now. because I believe that if we can centre that around children's communities and get primary schools, secondary schools, colleges working together to help the flow and journey of that child through the community, then we can best serve them. So there's a little snapshot of where, you know, my personal history has been in teaching.
I mean, it's great to actually know the man behind Fed effectively. I mean, I've seen obviously you during the summit in terms of the conversations you had and the talks and obviously the introduction you had. But it's nice to actually meet, like, know your journey, because I think it's always nice to know who we're buying into effectively. So I appreciate you going through it. I mean, one of the things that's quite interesting is because I'm a big believer of collaboration as well, and it's a massive part of the last 6 months for me in particular. But I think one of the things that I find sometimes a little bit frustrating in terms of education is the individualistic approach in terms of how schools operate. And I think, like, what sometimes gets to me is when you have certain schools in disadvantaged areas or areas in general, like in particular, maybe in London, like where I'm from, you have schools that are outstanding, and then you've got two children that kind of play together on Saturdays. One is born down the road from each other, and one goes to an outstanding school and one goes to a requires improvement school or a special measure school. And it's down to their location that they're getting a different quality of education. But in my opinion, like, every school in the area, very similar to Finland, like every school in every area should be on a level playing field. And I think that only happens through collaboration, doesn't it?
Yeah, collaboration in school improvement. And, you know, we heard the government talk about that yesterday. And you know, wherever you come from, by the way, on the political spectrum, whether you're the Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Newsom, or whether you were a Secretary of State under Labour, you still know that collaboration is the key to improving outcomes for young people, because it can address what you've just said. You know, it can mean that the school that's 2 miles away from the other school, and one school is doing better than the other, that those schools should work together and to improve things. And indeed, why shouldn't they work together? All too often, we feel that they are cities on a hill, and they can't connect, and that shouldn't be the case. And that's partly due to our profession, in the way our leaders probably degree leading schools. That culture is changing. They are recognising that you know, that collaboration is the key, and it's our responsibility as a profession as well, in terms of the way we work together, to realise that where that doesn't exist, then we should make that happen. And that, you know, I don't mean forcibly. I mean, you know, in a professional, collegiate manner, where we can have conversations and not feel threatened by one another in terms of that leadership journey. I'm always a great believer, and the phrase that I use, I use an example. So Silicon Valley, most people know about Silicon Valley, on the west coast of America. Well, they don't know it's set up at the same time on the east coast of America. And the one difference between both of those projects that was set up was weather. On the west coast, people in different businesses went out during the evening and chatted and had meals and drinks. Some of them got married. And therefore, there were no corporate secrets because things were shared. Over on the East Coast, where the weather wasn't so great, people did culturally collaborate because they didn't go out and have meals with each other and drinks with each other. Now, the weather was a big difference in both of those, and it changed the success. And what we've got a responsibility to do as leaders in the profession is create the right weather so our leaders, our teachers, our support staff can collaborate together on the one thing that I always say to my own group of schools that we're here for. And if we're here for children, then we won't have a job. And that's the thing that we've mostly got to remember.
Absolutely. I mean, do you think that can happen as long as league tables and Ofsted labels exist?
It's an interesting comment you make there. And I was very fortunate a few years back to be in the Singapore education system for a period of time. And I learned an awful lot there. I'm a great believer that you know, we've got a really highly thought of education system in England from the global perspective. Yeah. Globally, we are seen as leaders in the education marketplace. So many countries want our teachers and leaders to be in theirs. and it's a brain drain in many ways from that point of view, and it has been for many, many years. But I'm a great believer that you should look outward facing globally to understand, what's going on in the rest of the world. So it's fascinating how the Singapore education system operated from whether it be grassroots all the way up the top to Secretary of State there. And they don't have league tables. Parents do. And there's a grassroots movement from parents as on social media, and they have league tables that parents do. So the point is this: you've asked me the question that, do I think excessive league tables and account helps improve standards over time and helps drive collaboration? Probably not. And that's the evidence we see, not just from education, but all sorts of life around the world, business, education, communities. However, there is something inbuilt in us as human beings that wants to evaluate against something else, that wants to chart our journey. And in a place like Singapore, who don't have league, parents create league tables to know which school they want to get their kids into. So what I'm saying is, even without formal league tables, it still happens, and I've seen it happen in places in the world. And therefore, I think we need to better understand human behaviour and the way we think about it, to understand what accountability systems we should probably have in our system for the next 10 years. It's so easy to say, let's scrap accountability systems, let's scrap Ofsted. We know that won't work. So how cleverly go about learning from what we already know now and learning from the rest of the world, cleverly go about creating the systems that perform best for us and get the best standards and encourage collaboration at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me personally, even following Simon Sinek, one of the things that I try to practice is growth mindset. So it's not worrying about kind of being in competition with anybody else. It's only being in competition with yourself. So making sure you're improving from the previous day, and holding yourself accountable to do that. And I think sometimes we have these metrics that are very generic across the nation, whereas everybody's on their own journey. And it's the same with when you're managing staff, when you're managing students, every single person is on their own journey. So sometimes what I struggle with is the high stakes accountability being as generic as it is, so what would be the alternative if we were going to have a different accountability system?
Well, as chair of the Fed, I would we need to consider that very carefully, and over the next year, that may well be one of the discussion points of the continued work of the Fed in our 4 work streams we announced earlier in the week for year 2 of the Fed. Certainly an important point. Let's just give you an example. Yesterday, Secretary of State made a comment that perhaps if you were a school that had 3 requires improvement grades, you should think about you should become a full academy. I will try and look at things through the prism of being fair, and in essence, and I say this as a leader in a school rather than the chair of the Fed, I think he was quite reasonable in saying that. If you've got a child that's in a required improvement school, and you're saying that the journey of that school, we all know, takes time. David Carter, who was the previous national secretary I've known for many years, will always be very clear to say that the improvement journey isn't done in a year or 2. It takes potentially a decade of cultural change in a school that's in difficulty to really embed that. So it isn't a quick fix, and suddenly you get better results. And actually, then in a year or 2, they're down again. Cycle there, and that cycle where schools are trapped in is the most difficult thing. So David Carter's and other colleagues that are absolutely right. The long-term change, and that's the key, long-term, requires time and effort over the longer term. Now, I would consider probably, a time between an inspection that's RI of, say, 2 or 3 years, say 18 months to 2 years, probably over a period of time, and then 6 to 7 to 8 years to show that a school isn't in our eye anymore and you're moving in good to outstanding as reasonable. So as ever, the devil's in the detail in the conversation piece around these things. But our accountability system, of course, is made up of different elements. It's made up of an exam system. And only today we've seen the chief exec of the exams regulator saying that we should have a proper informed discussion about whether GCSEs are right for the future. And it is the right time to do that. All our work in the Fed in the last year, the only consultation for education anywhere in the world that's happened during a pandemic, and therefore has shown some real interesting insights into the development of our system, has indicated that it's the right time, 18 months, to review everything that we've got in our accountability system. And so the best way we can do that is through a common sense approach to what we need for the future and how levers can be pulled in our system to make things better. And one of the elements of research come out of our work in the Fed is that if you are a politician that's been a Secretary of State over the last 20 years for education, and they all agree this, they really struggle when they're in the job to understand which levers to pull to engage positive change, because we have one of the most complication systems in the world. And we really do. I've been very fortunate to speak and know very well world leaders from our education systems across the globe, and they can explain their education system in about 3 minutes flat. It takes an hour to explain our education system, and then they'll sit there and think, I don't understand what you're saying. So we have a very complex education system. And that's been developed over hundreds of years. And we need to, therefore, every time we engage, therefore, we don't have many levers in the system to easily pull, like other countries do when they want to change something. And we don't always, therefore, when we're going to change, consider the complexities of our system to get the change that we want.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of that, because it's so complex, it almost makes it less adaptable. And it's quite, I was speaking to, is it Matthew Jessup, who's the head teacher of Crosswaith Primary School in Cumbria. And he explains there's a 400-page curriculum, for example. And it just seems like every time there's a new EdSec, which is every 18 months, historically over the last 20 years, it just seems like they come in with new ideas and they put something else into the curriculum. And you talk quite and rightly so about a long-term plan, and it's really difficult to do when the education secretary changes every 18 months. I mean, is it about time that education stops being a political football and it starts becoming more of a collective effort in terms of what we need to do to develop the right education system and the right plan for the future?
Yeah, you again ask a very interesting question there, and I suppose I can give some reflections on the benefit of my experience. So I've been very to work with Secretary of State for Education going back, the last 14 years. And I have never, ever worked with the State of Education or a minister that doesn't want the best for our children and our country in terms of education. They often are struggling to know in our very complex system the levers to pull. And they are quite right. The average tenure of a Secretary of State is about 18 months. And I suppose, what people in the business world constantly tell me, and business are a big part of what, the consultation of the Fed is trying to do, is that you wouldn't run a business with the top leader changing every 18 months. Yes, service. And yes, we have somebody like Nick Gibb, who's been there for a long time and is a very good example of consistency in an education system to get change in an education system, because he's been there and he's stayed in place. But I guess that's probably by pure luck more than anything else, because we live in a political cycle of every 5 years. We get a new government in place, usually with a new prime minister. And in actual fact, if you look at the last 10 years, prime ministers have lasted about three years, not the 5 that they've been appointed to. So you're right in saying there's an awful lot of political. Within that, there are some bright rays of hope of long-termism. that I've described. And it's the long-termism we need to think about, because a child's journey in our education system is 15 years, if we talk about rising threes up to 18. 15 years is the length of a journey of my children in our education system now. I've got a 14-year-old, 11-year-old, and everybody else's child. And I think that those children deserve an element of stability, but I don't think we should have only stability. I think we should have agility, because the world is changing dramatically all the time, and we shouldn't have policies in education, and our curriculum needs to evidence and see that. You know, the world is changing, and we need to change with it, else we'll get left behind. But we need to have that mix of stability and agility to make that happen. And yeah, I would describe it like this, that we live in a democracy, and that democracy means that an election is held every 5 years, a party is in charge, and that party then, from the Prime Minister downwards, appoints ministers to look after portfolios in our country. Our education portfolio, minister changes an average about 18 months or so. And I think that needs to be longer. I think that needs to stop. I think, quite frankly, our education secretaries need to be given more time to be able to make the change that they want. I think that should be with collaboration across the education sector. But the reality, we're only going to see, as our business colleagues have said so many times, real success in a system. We have that longevity, if we have that long-term lens. The short-termism bit must be ironed out, and we must do that, I think, in the next 18 months. And we must look at a way that we can allow our politicians who come into the job with, I can only say how I found it, the best will in the world to want to make positive change in our education system, but the inability to have the levers to pull to do it. Because our system has been layered up and layered up and layered up over hundreds of years. And as a consequence, it's the most complicated education system in the world. We must decomplicate it. We must think about how we can better pull levers in it to give all of us, and this is the real key, to unleash potential, whether you are the education that wants to see the change but doesn't know how to get there, whether you are a leader in our system that wants to do that, whether you are a support staff, and we're doing it for our children at heart, to pull those levers and change and make that change. And we can't do that at the moment in the way we want to, because our system is so complicated.
Absolutely, I think you're bang on. I mean, obviously we could talk about the kind of education system as a whole. Like, I could talk to you about this forever, right? But ultimately, I just I want to get more of an insight in terms of Fed. So I mean, obviously, it started back in 2019, just before the pandemic, didn't it? Like towards the end of the calendar year. I mean, what kind of pushed you to start moving in that direction and start forming Fed? And like, kind of, what's the journey been until this point?
Yeah, so good question again. In actual fact, although we launched in 2019 formally as the Foundation for Education Development, I and a few colleagues have been working on the idea of a vehicle, such as the Fed, to be a neutral, independent space to allow these sort of conversations to take place. You know, broadly looking at our education system, we have lots of organisations that are interested in you know, pushing, quite rightly, what they believe in. But we don't have many organisations that offer that independent, neutral space actually as a mirror for the education system to come together to discuss the big challenges of the day, one might say, and the solutions to those collectively. So back about, I think it was about 5 years ago now or so, perhaps 4, I was elected as president of the Association of School College Leaders. And each president tends to have a theme for the year. My theme was that I thought our country needed a long-term plan for education. And although it was my theme for the year, it wasn't my idea, I think lots of people have talked about it over time, and they've often said that's a really good idea, but really difficult to do because our education system is so complicated. And I've always been a believer that even though it's complicated, we shouldn't say, oh, well, I won't bother then. So I was fortunate to use that platform as president of ASCL to talk around the country whether it be for politicians or leaders, or to say, wouldn't it be good if we could chart a journey out, try and have a long-term plan for education? So you do the president of ASCL for a year, and then you because it's an honorary position that you anymore, and the next president comes in. So when I did that, I realised through that year that it was really difficult to have discussion as a union leader, because the perception was you had a vested interest. So I realised that to continue that conversation, we needed a neutral, independent space to do that. And so working with a few leagues from business and education and politics, we came up with the idea of the Fed. And it took a little bit of a while, a few years, to be able to get a little bit of funding, not much, but a few donations behind us, then to launch the Fed off, which we did in December 2019, before anybody had heard of the word COVID-19, and the pandemic was a film that you watched that scared you when you went to bed and you woke up in the morning and you thought, thank God everything's fine. So we launched that in 2019 with an express view that we had no opinion in the Fed other than we believed that the country needed a long-term education, and we were there to support the development of the thoughts behind that. And we started to launch that through some consultation events, which were physical events at the time, of course. And what we did there is we invited some people. We had to start somewhere that we knew, some teachers, some politicians, some business, to discuss it, to give us a foundling base on what we thought about. And the important thing about, well, that we set out an idea that we were inviting people to shape these ideas. Not a call for evidence. A call for evidence usually means you've made up your mind, and we have never made up our mind on anything other than we think there should be, not what should be in it, but we think it would serve the children of the country better if it were long term. So it's up to through collaboration, the stakeholders in the country to indicate what should be in it and what should be the processes. Now, as we went through the pandemic, and that started in March, that we needed to keep the focus on the long term, and we must discuss that. But importantly, we needed to go online. So we created something called Fedspace, and then we did virtually all our consultations online, and that was unbelievable because people flocked to us involved in the consultation. We probably gave a ray of hope about talking about the future in a very dark time where people needed to be able to express their views on that. So we captured, and we're probably the only organisation to do it in the world, the pandemic through an education lens totally through that 12 months. And we were able to get a real insight of what people's thoughts. And one of the most interesting things was when we started the consultation up, people would often say to us, this is a really good idea. I will not disagree with it because there's nothing to disagree with. There should be a long-term plan for education, but it's really, really difficult to do, Yeah. And I would say, yes, you're absolutely right. 12 months later, people have said, this is the right time to do it. We need this. And nobody ever says now, we shouldn't think about this. What they say is, we need to get this done and we need to think about how we're going to do it sensibly. Mm-hmm. The pandemic has affected the way people think about things. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, I've had so many amazing educators on my podcast from around the world, but a lot from here, from the UK as well. People like Dame Alison Peacock. But I've even had people like Lord Gibb Knight on, and we just had a lot of conversations about kind of the direction education needs to move in. And in some respects, what my worry is we're sort of starting to slowly go back to normal, and like we're kind of almost just going to continue as we've always continued. I mean, we had the big shout out at the beginning of this calendar year that there'll be no exams. I mean, they've just reworded it into assessments because all my nephew and nieces and all the kids that I know are pretty much still doing exams in halls, but they're just not called exams. So that's what my worry is. I mean, it just seems like we're always so hell bent on exams, and we're willing to put mental health at the second in some respects. And every year, we spend billions on mental health, and we can solve that problem by actually allowing teaching children how to self-regulate and how to work on emotional intelligence at a younger age, and I think things like art being removed from the curriculum when creativity is fundamental for the 21st century. Leadership and entrepreneurship is fundamental for the 21st century. I mean, Forbes came out with statistics that over the next 5 years, 75 million new businesses will be made, will be opened. So, I mean, like, how are we going to implement this long-term strategy, and what are Fed looking to do in terms of the initial steps to make that happen?
Yeah, well, one of the questions that's often asked is when are Fed going to do a long-term plan? It's not Fed's job to do a long-term plan. We live in a democracy. It's the government's job to think long-term over education. However, what the Fed's job is to do, is to allow people in our education system, our total stakeholders, including government, to come together to talk and come together to think about, if we were to get a long-term plan, what type of framework could we do it through? And that's what our journey is for the Fed in the next year, pulling together a framework that will enable us to create a long-term vision and plan for education in this country. Remember, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, got up in the House of Parliament, I think 2 months ago, and said that he wanted to see a long-term plan for education. So the work that we are doing here is completely in sync with our political leaders. They know, I'm sure, that as we come out of the pandemic, I've seen my own children affected by the pandemic. They grow up in a very different household than I grew up in, working class, probably to middle class. But I have seen my own children isolated in several. I have seen the way that has affected them. I've seen how nervous they've been about going back to school, and then I've seen how pleased they are about trying to get back to normality. And I've seen in my own group of schools that there's a whole range of things going on with children that is a long time to work out. And so, there's a bit of balance in the system there that we need to think about. And Sir Kevin Collins, as a recovery commissioner, I know he's thinking very carefully about those things, how we ensure that there's a balance between qualifications, I suppose, really, for those children are ready to go into the business world with the right qualifications that business recognise, and joy, enjoyment, that you can go and play a sport, do some art in your school, because that balance is needed from that point of view. But I think that there is a window of opportunity. You talked about things going back to normality, and let's face it, we all want a bit of normality back, don't we? We all want to be able to go to a pub for a meal. We all want to be able to go to a concert again, or a football game, or whatever it is. We crave a bit of normality again, and hopefully we're going back towards that now. However, what COVID did is it really stripped back lots of our systems, not just education, by the way, health, no doubt, business, the way we operate in town centres, loads of things we could talk about, but we're talking about education here, and it stripped back all the veneers, and it made us look at all those systems, education being one of them again, and learning the lessons of what we've seen in the last year, and then making sure that we take a sensible period of time, not years and years and years, but the next 18 months or so, to consider what it is we want out the next decade for our system, for our children's sake and our country's sake, is the right, sensible thing to do. And I feel we're on a journey as a country doing that. There are plenty of examples of that, and the next job is to support that type of thinking together in a collaborative manner. Yeah,
absolutely. I think collaboration is always the starting point, isn't it? And it's now about kind of what we're going to do. And I think you're probably right. I think you don't want to rush into any decision. I think what worries me a little bit, and I think just the general consensus when I'm speaking to other educators, is when you have like somebody like Gavin Williamson, because obviously you're talking about it's the government's job effectively. When you have someone like Gavin Williamson that is saying that the best way to teach is to stand at the front of a classroom, it's like behaviour's got to be in a certain way, like it is still very outdated to a lot of people. Like, so a lot of people still believe that is not the right way to go. I mean, you have your traditionalists like Catherine Burbow Singh that would agree with Gavin Williamson, and I think like you have an Xbox, you have a PlayStation. I think you always need a variety of choices. I think that's human nature, and I think it's impossible to want every single school to be exactly the same. However, there's a lot of educators that are more progressive, and they do believe that you need to be more interactive with the students. You need to have more of a presence. You need to be walking around and let children be empowered in terms of have a say in their own learning and what they choose to learn. I mean, like, can you see why certain educators wouldn't have faith in the government in terms of like a long-term plan for education?
And I can understand exactly what you're saying there. I wonder. There is in the last few years been this element, and you just referred to it. This phrase, and I don't like the phrase. I'll be straight with you. Traditionalists versus progressives. I don't see that as a leader in schools, as somebody that's that is a teacher at heart. I was very fortunate to be successful as a teacher working with children, because I put the children at everything that I did. I was a strong disciplinarian, still am, yeah. In fact, I was only coaching my children's teams last night, an under-13 cricket team. And I had 28 kids, so I had a class for an hour. It was freezing cold. It was about -1. It wasn't cricket weather in any way, shape or form. But I had to speak to a couple of those who were, when I was talking to them, messing around. They know I'm straight. I don't want them messing around. I want to be able to teach them. So I'm a strong traditionalist from the point of view of discipline matters, but my heart is with kids. It always has been. And I like to think I had a good mix as a teacher, because those kids knew that if they listened to me, they would do well. Yeah. So I suppose I blended, which is why I don't recognise traditionalist and progressive approaches, that into my style of learning. As a teacher and as a leader. So I don't recognise that there's this argument between the two. And I suppose going back to Secretary of State Gavin Williamson, like you, I've seen some of the things that he said. My take on what he said is that that he's basically said that, and I don't think I'm the only one in this, but I'm trying to be balanced. He's basically said that when kids are coming back from the pandemic, you may find out that you've really got to understand, kids need good discipline. So I'm with that. And I wouldn't call myself a traditionalist, and neither would I call myself a progressive. But I do think that there'll be people out there that there are 7 people I used to teach that are now teachers. Yeah. And I like to think that I didn't scar them for life because they wanted to be a teacher. But I think that the Secretary of State has probably tried to talk about support of the education workforce by saying, good discipline is the foundation of good learning. I agree with that, by the way, and it is. And though, what I would say is that some colleagues, and understandably as well, find that hard to digest when it comes from a politician who's not been a teacher. And that's not Gavin Williamson's fault. He's not been a teacher. He's a Secretary of State for Education. His job is to listen to professionals. And I think it's a delicate version there, because you've got a Secretary of State who's probably saying, I want to support you in having good discipline in schools. That's not a bad thing. But he's not a teacher or a leader, so he's never done that. And I guess some colleagues find that hard to. And I guess it shines a light on the fact that we've never really fully understood the way our education system, per se, the professionals, interact with our politics in charge of our education system. For me, that's what it shines a light on most of all, that we must get better at that interaction point. An example of that would be, if we go back 10 or so years, we had the National College for School Leadership. They were a buffer in between often what politicians wanted and what the profession wanted. And they were able to intercede in things. And often what we get these is that going on because there's no cartilage in between, no buffer, whether that be, an organisation or not. And I think, therefore, the Secretary of State, whoever the Secretary of State is, comes out with messages that inherently aren't bad messages, but because he's never been a teacher or she has never been a teacher, they aren't often well received, some people in the profession. And I think that's what we see sometimes, especially in our social media, that, is an advent over the last 5 years or so that nobody could predict, really, where everybody's got a voice.
I mean, you're right. I think there is a disconnect. I mean, I don't disagree with that. I think, like, even from my point of view, I think looking out from the outside, I feel like mental health is being compromised for good discipline in some respects, in the way that sometimes Gavin Williamson comes across. And even like saying like longer days or working over summer holidays. I mean, if there's a teacher recruitment retention problem, if there was one before, I mean, that's only going to make things worse. You know, I mean, like there's a lot of pressure on the teaching profession. I mean, you try to do the best you can in a system that is a little bit, in my opinion, outdated, and hence why we're talking about a 10-year plan. I mean, what he's basically, the way it comes across is he's putting more pressure on the system because we haven't, as a profession, done enough for these children, you know. And actually it's like, well, these children have gone through whatever they've gone through in the last 12 months, and a lot of them have struggled. And like, in my opinion, the first thing that schools should be worried about when children come back is their mental health, and making sure that they feel safe and secure when they come back. Ultimately, you're right, discipline, they need to have high aspirations. They need to know that they need to behave in a classroom. But I think if you're like yourself, I mean, you're probably in the middle, because you got the children and they were engaged in your lessons. I think that came naturally to you in some respects, you know. And I think the way that it sometimes comes across from Gavin Williamson, it's a very military approach, and it's, well, the children, like, you've got to get them up, like you've got to catch them up effectively. Whereas we're almost disregarding like what the teachers have done over the last 12 months, and actually what the students might have learned. You know, and I think they might have learned a lot of resilience and understanding of how the world works, and in terms of technology and how to do Zoom meetings. And there's a lot of that they probably, like, a lot of positives that they would have taken away from the last 12 months that they wouldn't have if the pandemic didn't happen, you know. And I think there's a lot of skills that we can now use in terms of what they've learned over the last 12 months, and kind of really like crack on with that, you know. And I think that we're almost missing a trick if we're just trying to catch them up, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think that phrase "catch up." You know, if you listen to Kevin Collins, who's, you know, masterminding the recovery plan, which I don't think is going to be a plan that lasts for a year. It's going to be much longer than that. Yeah. Although I don't necessarily prescribe to how long it's going to last. What I mean by that is, I think children, through my own experience, are much more resilient than we sometimes as adults. We've all been children, remember, but we forget what it was like, because we do when we grow up. Yeah, and much more resilient than times you give them credit for. And I think some children will bounce back relatively quickly, others might not. And that's why you refer to, you know, the focus on mental health. So Kevin, in the work that he's doing to develop this plan, I know very much has at its heart the need to want to support children to have better, you know, mental health, to come back out of the pandemic feeling that they can be renewed in terms of the things that they're doing. And I know there's a focus on that. I know there's also a focus on potentially, you know, having, you know, longer school days and perhaps, you know, summer school. Although I haven't necessarily seen that that's entirely about attainment. That's also about the things that you mentioned about before, you know, enjoying PE, enjoying a sport, enjoying art, enjoying music. So it's going to be varied. It's actually about trying to enrich the lives of children. And I've worked all my career in areas of great disadvantage. And those opportunities don't always exist the way they might do for my own children, for example, that you know, are a bit more middle class than I grew up in, let's say. But it is right to want to put resources in those children having those opportunities, now more so than ever, given that lots of them have spent a lot of time in lockdown. And that's what I'm seeing at the moment from the conversations that I'm seeing coming out from number 10 in the DFE, that there's a need to focus on that. So as ever, advice that I'd give is, let's wait and see. Let's wait and see what the outcomes are of potential plans to move forward. Let's wait and see what the profession is asked to do. I can understand the reticence of any leader or teacher, where suddenly we might have to, you know, do 2 or 3 hours extra a day. of the workload that's already out there. But I don't honestly think that that's necessarily the intention of some of the conversations that are taking place at the moment. I think it's how we can better serve our communities by putting more activities on for children past the traditional hours and in different times. We've run in my group of schools, summer schools, for the last 6 years. They might either be to come along. Some of that will be what the government's talked about now, do some basic English and maths to help, or whatever the case might be. And a good part of it sometimes is to enable those children that are on pupil premium to have a decent meal during the summer holidays or Easter. And we've done that for years. And it's no bad thing that should be the country in every school, if I'm honest with you.
Yeah, fair enough.
How it's implemented is the sort of debate, which, will need to be done in a proper manner with the profession. And I see there's those opportunities out there to do that. But I do know that that Kevin's working very hard at the moment, Kevin Collins, that is, and I would expect some form of an out perhaps towards the end of May, as I think has been articulated in the last few days. And then I suggest that we wait and see what that announcement is before we worry too much.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, Carl, you've been absolutely brilliant. I mean, is there anything you want to just add on before we finish the podcast?
No, what I'll say is that, listen, thanks very much for your time. I always enjoy a conversation like this. It's very rich about education. Get involved with the work of the Foundation for Education Development. Our website is there for all to see, open, and we're completely neutral and independent. And I would encourage all your listeners to want to engage with the work that we're doing and have their voice heard. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for your time.
No, absolutely. I think more than ever, we need a platform like Fed to for all to be involved. I think there's always been a lot of conversations with individual groups about kind of what's needed. I think this platform almost gives everyone a chance to have their say in kind of have their input in terms of the way that education is going to move forward. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity for the long-term plan of education. Really looking forward to kind of where it goes. And yeah, I mean, I think if there was ever going to be a push in terms of a transformation in education, it's going to be after a pandemic like we've had over the last 12 months. So yeah, really looking forward to seeing what the Fed does. And yeah, Carl, thank you so much for coming on. I know you're a really busy man, so appreciate you coming on and giving us a better insight of what Fed are up to.
You're quite welcome, TJ. Thanks very much.
Thanks.